House of the Dragon, people. How good does it feel to get a piece of the Game of Thrones world back? After 8 years of Game of Thrones and 2 of those final years being lackluster, after 2 to 3 years of absolutely no Game of Thrones at all, we were left in such a bad spot. I think at one point a lot of us thought that we would never see the light of day of that entire saga ever again. That's how abysmal the final season was. And even though I wasn't completely against it, I will always want more Game of Thrones. We were wrong if we thought that this show could not hold up to the hype of Game of Thrones, because it absolutely 1,010,000% did. The show is just as epic as it ever has been. Now, I will say, it truly cannot replicate season 1 of Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones did so many different things, and it got rid of a lot of your generalized tropes in TV storytelling that when we watch season 1 for the first time, they changed the narrative in so many different ways. We could never see things coming. That's why it captivated us so much, and that's why moving forward into future seasons, you could never truly know what was going to happen next. Of course, unless you've read the books, but even by that point, they change things for TV shows. But just because House of the Dragon season 1 can't really compare to the epicness of season 1 of Game of Thrones, that does not mean that it's not epic in its own right and it isn't a good show, because it absolutely is. In my opinion, this is peak storytelling. This is peak television. Everything you want from Game of Thrones is thrown into House of Dragon and pretty much executed just as well. Now, I think the biggest issue with the show is its pacing. We'll get into that. Usually, I don't like using pacing as a reason to give a show or a movie or any piece of medium a bad review, because I feel like it's just a really sloppy cop-out way of basically saying, yeah, this wasn't good because of pacing. It's just a generalized excuse, but sometimes pacing can be a little poor, and within this show's case, I do think it suffers from it a little bit. Now, I could go through every single actor and actress who came through this show and applaud every single one of them for their performance, but the reason why I will not do that is because I would never leave this chair and this video would never end. So I'm going to start with everyone's favorite character, including mine, Daemon Targaryen, Matt Smith. I think everything about the character is fascinating. His drive, his influence, his knowledge, his power, his courage, his strength, his dragon, probably one of the coolest dragons in the show. But Daemon really carries himself in a manner that other powerful Game of Thrones characters have before. For example, Jaime Lannister, Jon Snow, Brienne Tarth. There's a lot of really cool characters in that show that when they're on screen, you can feel their presence. But I would argue that there has never been a character like Daemon in the sense that he literally is powerful. Nobody, and I mean nobody, can stand up to this guy. When he is in the room, you know that he is the most powerful one there. I don't care if you are a king or queen. When he is there, he is in charge. And I think what makes his character so important in his power model is the fact that it's not just everybody around him who sees him that way. He himself sees himself that way. He has the utmost confidence in who he is and what he's doing and simply just how to handle people. It's a ton of fun to watch on screen, and I think that's why all of us are so captivated by his character. Rhys Ifans as Otto Hightower, this guy is so good in pretty much anything he touches. Comparing him to Tyrion or Tywin or any other person who had the position of the Hand in Game of Thrones, he's very different in the sense that sure, he's a little aggressive, he's a little harsh in his decision making, but I think we have to remember at this point in time, there was no true game for the throne the way it is in Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, everybody wants the throne. The lineage of an heir was so broken that Everybody thought they had the right to it. The Lannisters wanted it, the Baratheons wanted it, the Starks wanted it. Even if a character never came out and said, I want the throne, you knew deep down they did. And within House of the Dragon, there isn't that seven kingdom brawl for the Iron Throne. The Targaryens are so high at their power that they believed only they should have the throne. So to see a family like the Hightowers kind of weave their way in as one of the first families that we've seen on screen actually make a case and a battle for the throne, it's very interesting to see how Otto Hightower was capable of managing this civil war. Paddy Considine as King Viserys, great choice. And you know what? He has a similar presence to King Baratheon in season 1 of Game of Thrones. Is he a good king? Probably not. I mean, he got cut by the throne, and there's the whole idea that if you get hurt by the throne, maybe you shouldn't be sitting on that chair in the first place. And other than being constantly manipulated and poisoned by the Hightowers, that is what eventually did him in. But to see a king who actually does have a heart, it was nice to see, other than a warmongering tyrant sitting on the throne 24/7 like we did in Game of Thrones. And if anyone who wasn't like that when they had the throne, they didn't last long at all. Some other great characters like Princess Rhaenys and Lord Corlys, fantastic additions to the cast. But let's talk about the two most important characters in this entire show, Renera and Allison. So respectively, for Renera, we have Millie Alcock and Emma Darcy. And for Allison, we have Emily Carey and Olivia Cook. Now, I understand the complaints people had about changing the actresses halfway through the season. I would have had no problem if this show really wanted to stretch its narrative, and if they chose to focus on season 1 as the younger versions of their characters, and then maybe season 2 we begin with the older versions. I personally would have had no problem with it, but I understand why they moved so quickly, even if I would have done it a little bit differently, the way they handled how fast they were moving with the story. Now, talking about these 4 women's performances, I have absolutely nothing but good things to say about them. In another dimension, we're probably getting the House of the Dragon right now, where instead of recasting these girls, they kept the original younger girls to continue this storyline. Although, the more I watched the season, I fully understand why these girls were recasted. Especially Millie, she would not fit an adult Renera. And I understand in real life, she is a 23, 24-year-old girl. I know she'd be old enough to play this role, but when you look at her, she does not look old enough. I understand if maybe you don't like it. I understand if you're still 50-50, but overall, I do now appreciate more the changing of actresses. It really is just something that we all had to kind of get over. Like, okay, it is what it is now. We have to move forward with it, but I 100% understand the decision. That, of course, does not mean it's final for them. We have so much history and so much dialogue we could still get from the younger versions of them. Flashback scenes are very easy in a world like Game of Thrones. Now, when you look at the production of this show, it is wild. It's insane. I know that Game of Thrones had a $10 million budget per episode, so that ended up coming to like $100 million every season. I did not look too much into the details of the budget for House of the Dragon. I wouldn't be surprised if it's more. Think about it. We're getting more dragons than we ever did in Game of Thrones. Every single person in the Targaryen household, even Valerians, every single person who is born from a Targaryen will pretty much have a dragon to themselves. With that being said, you're gonna see dragons everywhere, flying around, in battle, maybe just curled up in their dungeon sleeping. You're gonna see them all the time. The budget needs to be higher, I would imagine, than it has been before. And watching this season, man, it puts other shows to shame. It puts these companies to shame. It puts some of these movies to shame. I cannot believe how brilliant the CGI and special effects department was. If I hit my head and lost my memory and saw this show for the first time, I would believe that dragons were real. Now, we had a couple of really great dragon scenes this season. I can only assume season 2 is going to get so much better from here, because I think dragons are going to be a very pivotal role for the future of the show. There's no way it isn't, and we're gonna see a lot more dragon battles where that came from. Now, because I've pretty much been gushing about the show, I do just want to quickly talk about what I wasn't a fan of, and that was the pacing. I think the biggest struggle with the show that people are having is how quickly the story moves, but in very, very strange ways. I think a lot of the time the story jumps in big time gaps, and it does get a little difficult meeting these characters all over again with new actors and actresses, and it starts to make you get a little confused on who's this and who's this and who's this. I also think time jumps had a big implication on the presence of certain characters, and one of my biggest complaints about the show is how quickly they killed the biological father of Renera's children, Harwin Strong. In Game of Thrones, they would have built up his character long enough to the point where you absolutely love him, and then just to screw with you, they would have killed him in the worst fashion possible. In House of the Dragon, you only see him for one episode before he gets killed, and even when he does die, the scene was so hectic and so hard to see that you could barely even tell if that was actually him who was dying in the fire. I think the show does certainly suffer from a certain utilization of characters. Maybe some characters are overutilized, and maybe some characters have not been utilized enough. Those are issues I'm easily capable of getting over. They're not going to ruin the show at all for me. They're just things I've pointed out. Now, before I give you my rating on the show, I do want to quickly talk about what this means for the future of the Game of Thrones series, where we could go from here. Within season 2 of House of the Dragon, I actually think this show has the potential to be one of the best seasons of TV we've ever seen. And the reason why I think that is because even though the final episode of this show was not over the top one of the best episodes I've ever seen, but it opens up the door for season 2 to be absolutely insane. When I think about the season premiere of season 2, I already have like 5 or 6 different ways this show could open up, and all of them are epic. They've set the show up so perfectly to be so dominating in so many different ways. Even in Game of Thrones, because in season 8 they ruined the fight for the throne, but throughout it was more of a mental mind game. This is literally going to be storming the castle and taking what is rightfully yours. And I think that's what's going to make this so excitingly different. And then I just want to quickly say, with the Jon Snow sequel show, it certainly is ballsy making a show that takes place after the abysmal season 8. Even though I think there are some really interesting ways they can change the future for the better, with how good House of the Dragon is and can and will be, and with Jon Snow making his revival for a sequel, I think this Game of Thrones Westeros world is going to find themselves in a position where they're going to be dominating the TV streaming industry again. Now, to get into my rating of House of the Dragon, I am going to give the first season a 9 out of 10. I think this show is phenomenal in every way, and I think it captures everything we liked from Game of Thrones. Other than the pacing issues I think the show suffers from, and from some very strange character decisions that characters do make within the show, I think it overall is just a spectacle, and I think it is a show that is a must watch. And if you have never watched Game of Thrones, Thrones, if you know somebody who's never watched Game of Thrones, I suggest they start doing it now, because the enjoyment you find from that show, you will find that in House of the Dragon. But now, everyone, it is your turn to let me know in the comments below what you thought of House of the Dragon Season 1, if you liked it, if you loved it, if there's some issues you have with it. But in saying that, that is all I have for you on this one, guys, and until next time, I will talk to you all very soon.